This week I'm looking at Julius Evola, the Sufi of Rome, by a guy called Frank Gelli or Jelly, who's now actually a priest in the Church of England. But he was formerly a friend of Julius Evola before Evola's death, and so this is really a collection of conversations between the two. It's a kind of an informal collection of Evola's teachings based on conversations that he had with him. And now for me personally, I mean, Evola is one of my favourite thinkers, but many have remarked that his work can be very difficult, very inaccessible at times. I've never actually read Revolt Against the Modern World to completion, but Men Among the Ruins and Ride the Tiger, those are brilliant books by Evola, but themselves quite difficult, so this is quite enjoyable to read. It's much more, as I say, informal, less esoteric. It's kind of like the table talks, but for Evola. It's a collection of his opinions on different things, ranging from geopolitical issues of his day to his thoughts on Hitler and the SS and so on. But the thesis of the book, as you can tell by the title, is that the author believes that Evola was secretly an initiate in a esoteric Sufi order. Sufism is like the mystical tradition of Islam, and people that are familiar with the traditionalist school of the perennial philosophy will know that people like Genon and Shuon all converted to Islam through Sufism, and many of them saw Islam as really the best hope for the regeneration of tradition when they became disillusioned with the Christian church and the hope for traditionalist Catholicism reigning in the West again. Now, Evola rejected that on kind of a racial basis, and on sort of not wanting to give in to Orientalism, or so we're told. But the thesis of this book is that he was an initiate in a Sufi order, that he encountered Sufism through Genon, through other Sufi teachers. He says through meetings he had in Cairo that many of them were familiar with Evola, and this was maybe something of an open secret. Now, was Evola a Sufi? Well, I actually think it doesn't matter that much. I mean, if you read Evola, some would falsely sort of read him as an atheistic thinker, but he certainly isn't. Evola is a traditionalist. He believes in the perennial philosophy, and he does believe in an absolute transcendent God, like all perennialists do. But he tends to shy away from using the word God, I think because of the connotations that now come with that in Western monotheism, I guess especially from the Christian tradition. And so he will tend to use words like the absolute or the transcendent or higher reality, much more than that. But, this guy, Gelli, says that he was much more open about God in private, obviously among people that understood his teachings better. But whether or not he was a Sufi doesn't really matter, because as Evola was a perennialist, he was a traditionalist, and he had great respect for Islam, and that's something that kind of shines through in this, because again and again Evola talks about the regeneration that will come of Islam, and again he warns that the West and liberalism is not a force that can stand up to Islam, and this seems especially relevant today. He talks about Ataturk and his drive to modernize and secularize Turkey, and many times he mentions this idea from psychoanalysis that if you repress something it comes back in a stronger form, and he promises this with Turkey. He promises that they will again become more fundamentalist in their Islam. Perhaps we're seeing that now. He promises that even in Scandinavia, with the welfare state, feminism, and it being a beacon in social democracy, that always under the surface is, the Viking spirit. And again he promises that these forces can't be held in check. He even mentions, in one interesting part of the book, he mentions the Uyghurs in China, and he promises that the undoing of Chinese communism ultimately will be those spiritual forces of Tibetan Buddhism and Islam. And he specifically mentions the Uyghurs as a people that are carrying a perennial tradition and have an attachment to their race and to religion, and that's something that Chinese communism can't ultimately defeat. Now, when you encounter ideas like this, you see that Evola is really the most radical thinker you could read today. I mean, Jonathan Bowden called him the most right-wing thinker ever. And certainly, alongside maybe Savitri Devi, there's no one from the 20th century that you can read who challenges political orthodoxy more than Evola. And that's part of the value of Evola, is kind of the shock of Evola, and you get it throughout this. The shock of Evola, where all of the conventional wisdom, all of the basic starting points of political philosophy, of how we orient the modern world, he not only rejects all of it, but his worldview is the complete antithesis to it. In place of evolution, which is the doctrine of our day, Evola believes in involution, that people start from the higher and that we're regressing to lower and lower stages. We're in the Kali Yuga, the Dark Age, the most degenerate time imaginable. People, we base modern society on an orientation towards comfort, but Evola believes in asceticism as a spiritual value. We believe religiously in equality, but Evola's whole worldview is based around inequality and the value of genuine hierarchy and aristocracy. These things are expression of the higher values. And why is that? Why does Evola privilege warriors so much? Why does he privilege the heroic ideal? Why does he celebrate brutal warlords? Well, this is, again, a perennialist idea, but maybe less emphasized by people like Genon. The idea that the highest caste, traditionally in Aryan society, is the Brahmin caste, the priestly caste. And that's very much in line with a traditionalist worldview. But just beneath them is the Kshatriya class, the warrior caste. And they are above the merchant caste that dominates today. And Evola very much sees the West and the tradition of Europe as being a Kshatriya culture. And he sees great potential in that, whether it was the medieval knights or the Roman legionnaire or the Prussian soldier. These are expressions of that warrior ideal, which is maybe best exemplified in the Bhagavad Gita, where there's this idea of karma yoga. That's maybe very foreign to a Western audience, but the ideal of karma yoga that's presented in the Bhagavad Gita is that being a warrior, dedicating oneself to an ideal beyond oneself and then pursuing one's duty fanatically, that is a spiritual path in itself. That, just as the path of the ascetic or the monk who prays and meditates and fasts, that is a path to God, that is a path to transcendence. But equally, the warrior ideal, the Spartan ideal, is a form of asceticism, just as the monk's asceticism is a valid form of that. The asceticism of the warrior is also noble and valid, because it is the sacrificing of the small I, the individual egoic self, to that which is beyond oneself, that which is greater than oneself. And Evola, again and again, valorizes this ideal of war for war's sake, which maybe sounds misanthropic and nihilistic and destructive, but this isn't at all what Evola is getting at. What he's getting at is that in that absolute obedience, that absolute duty that he saw in potential forms in things like the SS, in that absolute commitment to duty and to the warrior ideal, regardless of what the cause is, regardless of what political ideal you happen to be fighting for, that's not actually the concern of the warrior. But in that absolute dedication to the asceticism of the warrior ideal, there is a transcendence of individualism. There is a movement towards the absolute, and that's what's expressed in the Bhagavad Gita, and that's again and again the ideal that Evola is trying to recapture. But to a modern audience, this is very foreign. As I said, it can seem nihilistic and misanthropic. But Evola's whole worldview is based on the traditionalist understanding that the traditional world divided reality into being and becoming, and the orientation of traditional societies was towards being. An absolute being in the form of the absolute, in the form of God, the ultimate reality. And whatever we did on the plane of becoming, for it to have significance, had to be oriented towards being, towards the absolute, towards transcendent values, truth, beauty, goodness. And this is what Evola sees in the warrior ideal. This is a way that we can orient being or becoming towards being. But the tragedy of the modern world, why the modern world is the absolute of degeneracy and degradation, is that we have completely lost touch with the realm of being. We've lost touch with initiatic rites, with magic, which, Evola will say is much understood, that magic is just a series of interactions with the material world that can have an impact on the realm of being. That we've lost touch with these traditions that gave us contact with the world of being. And this is where, his defense of monarchy comes in. And some moderns have tried to defend monarchy on the basis of like a kind of individual rights basis, like someone like Hans Hermann Hoppe, that, well, if you have a monarchy, that is the best way to actually protect everyone's individual rights, and that a monarchy will act in the best interests of people in the long run, and all these kinds of liberal justifications. This is anathema to Evola. Evola justifies things like monarchy and things like aristocracy and hierarchy on the basis that the king traditionally was meant to be a bridge between the material world and the spiritual world, that in places like ancient Egypt, the king's role and the priest's role were one. And this is where authority is derived from. It's derived from the world of being. But the modern world is one where we're completely reduced to becoming, where there is no basis for genuine authority or hierarchy, because all we have is this series of material relations. And this is why Evola has respect for Nietzsche. And this isn't something you find with the other traditionalists, which is, people like Guénon were quite scathing of Nietzsche, and I doubt that Guénon had actually read an awful lot of Nietzsche, but the traditionalists would write Nietzsche off as someone who didn't understand tradition, because Nietzsche's criticisms of Christianity, they very much come from a kind of modernist perspective, as many traditionalists would see it, and he's not holding up any sort of transcendent or traditionalist ideals against Christianity, and so it's a very kind of atheistic, humanist attack on Christianity. So they would have very much written off Nietzsche as a modernist, as someone who didn't understand tradition, who didn't understand the truth within Christianity. But Evola sees value in Nietzsche. And now, don't forget that Evola himself called himself a pagan Catholic. And that's touched on in this book. The author of this book says that Evola, he used the term pagan, not because he actually had a great attachment to paganism, but because pagan at that time was the word that could sort of gin up the bourgeoisie more than any word. And that if it had caused more angst among the middle classes to call himself a communist or an anarchist, that he might well have used that label for himself. That's the kind of person Evola was. There's no strand of conservative thinking in Evola. He's a traditionalist, he's a revolutionary, radical traditionalist, but he's certainly not a conservative. And he has utter disdain for the conservative thinking on the right and the left. He hates the establishment right, he hates the establishment left. I mean, Evola was very into Dadaism in his lifetime, this very modernist trend, because it shocked the bourgeois. It shocked the bourgeois element in people. And that's what Evola is all about. He has no attachment to the establishment right or to establishment conservatives. He wants to radically shock people. And so he's sympathetic to Nietzsche. He's much more sympathetic than someone like Guénon, because even if Nietzsche didn't have a traditionalist basis on which to properly oppose modernity with it, as Evola would see it, he recognized the rot. He had good instincts. He recognized the lack of the aristocratic principle of nature in the modern world, in this degenerated form of Christianity. And Evola sees Nietzsche as a great diagnoser of the sickness of our day, of the death of God. And he often cites Nietzsche. Much of Ride the Tiger is dedicated to Nietzsche. And much of this book, Evola echoes Nietzsche's criticisms of Christianity, of Christian morality. The idea of loving one's enemy. Evola has disdain for this idea. He says, the Greeks or the Romans would have considered you insane to entertain this idea. So he's very much in agreement with Nietzsche on this, and even crudely so. I mean, the traditionalists would differentiate between forms of eros and say that Nietzsche's criticisms were off the mark. But Evola recognizes something deeper in that. And he recognizes that tendency in Nietzsche to celebrate hierarchy, and to celebrate the warrior, and to celebrate the hiring man. He recognizes what's noble in that. Now, he would say that there's something kind of tragic in the Nietzschean attempt to overcome modernity, because again and again, Nietzsche, when he talks about hierarchy, when he talks about higher values, when he talks about overcoming slave morality, he's hinting at something greater. He is hinting at something, at some vertical plane rather than mere horizontal plane. He's hinting at something, a transcendent compass from which he can derive these values. But ultimately, it's a wholly immanent philosophy, and so what you're left with in Nietzscheanism is just power for the sake of power. Now, Evola believes that he can solve this with the traditionalist basis. And so, the Übermensch will not be Apollonian, but he will be Olympian, and he will adopt these ideals of the traditionalist man, of self-mastery before mastery of the world. And this is something that Evola cites a lot, is the doctrine of the two jihads in Islam. The outer jihad that's waged, through war and so on, and the inner jihad, which is conquering oneself and achieving mastery over oneself and virtue. And this is the greater jihad in Islam. And this is another reason that Evola respects Islam. Something that's often quoted from Evola is saying that the blood of the warriors is closer to God than the ink of the philosophers or the prayers of the faithful, something along those lines. Now, in this book, it says that Evola actually quoted that from a hadith. So it does seem like Evola respected Islam as a masculine tradition, as Nietzsche would have seen it. Nietzsche said that Islam was at least made for men rather than Christianity. But he recognizes Islam as embodying that sort of Kshatriya ideal. And so it's no surprise that Evola may even have been a practicer of Sufism. And again, this would be a shock to many people on the radical right, and this is why they often have contempt for people like Genon and Shuan and see them as traitors to their people, that they're willing to adopt a foreign creed like Islam or something. But Evola, and this often gets misunderstood, but Evola he's not so much a biological determinist, and he's a believer in spiritual race, and this is something that's often misunderstood, often ridiculed. But he uses the example of the Dutch, and he says, that there was some far-right organization in the Netherlands that wouldn't allow Mediterraneans to join because they didn't have pure Nordic blood or something. And, he says that, well, this kind of biological determinism is very crude, and he says it's very against his own teaching, and that the Dutch became a people, they became a mercantile people, they became a liberal people, they had a colonial mercantile empire in the Pacific, and that in that sense that spiritually they abandoned that warrior ideal, that spiritually they degenerated. And he again and again emphasizes this through the work, which is that ideals and ideas and things not of this world are much more powerful than race or biology or political ideology. And he even uses the example of the Bolsheviks. He says, to counterpose his ideas to Marxism says that ideas have lesser value. There is no transcendent. That ideology is determined by dialectical materialism, and that everything ultimately comes from economic material relations. And Evola kind of says that the Marxist example itself disproves this, because in modern communists there is something of the religious, there is something otherworldly. He talks about how brave the Bolsheviks fought in the First World War, that they were able to even beat off an allied invasion of Russia, and they were only stopped by the Polish. He says that there are other forces at play, that how energized the Bolsheviks were, how deadly they were, that these were dark forces manifest. In the same way that some of what was seen in Nazi Germany, some of what was seen with the SS, that it was as if these people had come up out of the ground. It wasn't as if modernity had produced these people. And that's very much in keeping with Evola's thought, that the greater doesn't come from the lesser. He doesn't subscribe to progressive evolution. The greater sort of comes from another world, comes from the world of being, and that the fascist project, failed though it was, and Evola is maybe the only person that was critiquing fascism from the right. He wrote books against fascism and National Socialism, fascism criticized from the right. But at the same time, he sees that fascism, and specifically something like the SS, was manifesting values and principles from another time, because those values and principles are themselves timeless. And that's why he's not very concerned with things of the world. He's not very concerned with political happenings. There was terrorism being done in his name. There were young radical right groups that were inspired by Evola. But he again and again discouraged violence, discouraged political terrorism, because ultimately he saw it as futile. Because we're in the Kali Yuga. Because there are forces governing the progress, or rather regress, of the world that are greater than us, that we can't understand, and that it's absolutely necessary that we must go through this transformation. We must endure the Kali Yuga, and we're no more in control of that than we will be in what comes after. But what comes after inevitably will be a golden age, but it's not going to be through democratic means. Evola could care less what the masses think. It will be through the manifestation of these higher principles. And at one point in the book he says that, the only time Evola really spoke about change in the world or acting politically was when he said that people like us, speaking to the room of people he was talking to as counter-revolutionaries, our job is to reorient the world, to re-spiritualize the world, to bring back the spiritual, to bring back the higher. And this is how Evola sees transformation as always happening. It's always the manifestation of otherworldly principles. The higher acts on the lower, and biology and genetics and all these things are just a reflection of higher realities, of the ultimate reality. And so Evola would reject the modern form of racialism as itself being kind of degraded and not hierarchical and equalitarian. And this is where you see how radical of a right-wing thinker Evola is. He is all the time looking for the higher, looking to orient things to the higher. Everything is about hierarchy, everything is about orienting oneself towards the absolute. There is a kind of egalitarianism in racialism where a racialist will look as the worst of their race as better than the best of another race. But Evola certainly wouldn't see it that way. Evola would see the Iranian Sufi or the Sikh warrior caste as being far superior than the typical European racialist. For Evola, it's about, what have you done? Your value is not a question of biology. It's not a question of genetic determinism. It's not a question of political class or any of these things. It's not a question of wealth, certainly. It's a question of what you've achieved, what you've made manifest, how much you've embodied the primordial tradition, how much you've submitted that which is lesser to that which is greater. And so, to finish off, there's one excellent passage from this book that is quite beautiful and really captures the essence of Evola as the modern heretic, as the most right-wing thinker of our age, as a man that really doesn't seem at home among the thinkers of the 20th century. Well, the author of this book asks Evola about Borges, the Argentinian novelist who was blind, and the affliction of blindness, and Evola says that there are worse afflictions than blindness. And he tells a story from H.G. Wells, a short story about the Valley of the Blind, that this traveller went to a village in South America, and everyone there had been blind for generations, and they had forgotten what it was that made them blind. They'd forgotten what sight was, and so this traveller started explaining to them about sight, explaining to them their affliction, and of course they thought he was mad, and they figured out that it must be these gaps in his skull that must be causing this, and so they started devising that they would perform surgery to remove his eyeballs to fix his problem and fix his insanity and make him like everyone else. And this wanderer promptly fled from the village and went another way. And then from a peak he looked down at the Valley of the Blind, and he kind of smiled and scoffed at them in contempt and bemusement. And Gelly says that the stranger of Wells' tale stood for Evola himself, the Sufi of Rome, someone who had become an alien to his own people, who had made himself into an outsider, who appeared to both left and right-wing establishments an outrageously deluded man, a pariah, a man beyond the pale, an intellectually untouchable figure. The sinister operation, the evil surgery Evola had refused was to conform, to follow the crowd, to accept the false ideologies, the myths of the 20th century. He had opted instead to uphold the path of tradition and transcendence. On the height of his mountain cliff, Evola was alone, yes, but he was true to himself. Free, like Borges, he had not let his physical impairment embitter him. He had borne his sufferings with stoic resignation, nor had he allowed the ostracism to which his person and works had been subjected to stunt him psychologically. No, from his inner mountain heights he, like the stranger, could look down on the blind, deluded folks below with a smile of contempt on his lips, aware that, unlike them, he had not surrendered. In his own way, through his chosen self-martyrdom, he had refused to be blind to the light. That is Julius Evola, the Sufi of Rome.